welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. Today, you'll be hearing an interview with Sam and David Suisman, Associate Professor of History at the University of Delaware and author of an award-winning book, Instruments of War, which covers the role of music in the U.S. military and the lives of American soldiers. It's a fascinating book that really focuses on something that I think we don't really think about when we think about music. But as the book details, music has played a major role throughout the history of the U.S. military in very unexpected ways. For example, permanently installing pianos in Navy ships. Also, we're obviously covering this because it's also a bit topical right now for more unfortunate reasons. But the book is really fascinating, and it's a great interview. But before you hear that interview, just a quick note. Sam and I have been doing this podcast and now newsletter covering the intersection of music and capitalism from various different angles for nearly over 5 years now, that's really hard to believe. It's always been a labor of love, and we hope it's been as enriching for you as it has and continues to be for us. Sam and I clearly have never thought of this as anything more than a kind of like intellectually edifying project that covers a topic that seems to get overlooked, and it sometimes supplements also our own work and our interests. But we've never had a staff, and we've never tried to make this into a small business. We're terrible capitalists, essentially. We're not capitalists. It's just really a genuine no-frills project, really just fueled off our own curiosity. And it's been really great to see that it's resonated with so many people. And, of course, a big thanks to those who have and continue to be a part of our small community of readers and listeners. And so, with all that being said, if you are a regular listener, can you do us a favor and just think about subscribing to our newsletter for a few bucks? A paid subscription, it will get you access to our entire archive, but more importantly, it will just kind of help us pay the bills and continue to bring this work to you for another 5 years. And, Sam and I do have some project ideas we'd like to bring into the world, and, a few bucks a month can really make that into a reality as well. As you've probably heard, you can subscribe at moneyfornothing.substack.com. That's the number 4. Also, it will keep you updated on when our episodes drop, and you'll also get, the occasional newsletter that expands on topics we've covered in the podcast and also covers certain salient news items that maybe weren't so ready for an hour-long podcast convo, but worthy enough of a very critical and thoughtful 800-word hot take. Okay, with that all being said, here's the interview with Sam and David Suisman on his book, Instruments of War.
Hurrah, hurrah, I shout with all my might. Hurrah, hurrah, I had a sweet dream last night. I stood with a maid in a beautiful place and breathed perfume of ribbons and lace. And then I woke up with a foot in my face. I'm in the army now.
Okay,
I'm in the
our
army
guest
now.
today is David Suisman, who's a professor of history at the University of Delaware, who's here to talk about his latest prize-winning book, Instrument of War, Music and the Making of American Soldiers. David, thank you so much for coming on Money for Nothing.
Thanks, Sam. Happy to be here.
For those who don't know, David is the scholar on Tin Pan Alley. If you haven't checked out his earlier work, we've definitely talked about it on the podcast. And his latest project takes a very different perspective on music, one that I think is unfortunately profoundly retains its profound relevance, which is that music, for all its wonderful characteristics, is also sometimes the power of music can be used for many things, I guess, is maybe one of the central driving forces of this book. And in particular, it can be used for the purposes of the military. And so maybe to start with, I think one of the shocking things that you kind of reveal in the very beginning of the book is that the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, is the world's largest employer of musicians. I'm so wondering, maybe to talk a little bit about that and what it means and how you started this project.
Sure. The U.S. military is, as you say, the world's largest employer, single employer of musicians, and that's the result of music being a big part of military life in lots of different ways that I'm sure we'll talk about. But it's not one thing; it's many different things in the military. And this is a project that I came to when I was researching some other things. I thought I might be doing a project on sonic weapons and sound in the military. And I found that music was it kept coming up, let's say. And it came up so much that I realized that I needed to get a handle on what that actually encompassed. And it turned out to be a subject so much more complex and so much more varied than I expected when I started looking at it, that I realized that that was actually going to be a whole book. And there was no other serious scholarship on music in the military writ large. People have been making music in relation to war. War has involved music since time immemorial, but there's actually very little scholarship on music and war. And when I say music and war, I'm talking not just about military bands, but all different aspects of musical activity in war making. So the last uh, sort of survey book on this subject was published in the 1950s. And I realized, and it's a tiny little book, it's like 112 pages long or something. And so I realized that there was a big subject here. It was sort of hiding in plain sight. It was something that people know something about. Most people are familiar with some aspects of music and war, music in the military, um, but there's never been any kind of comprehensive or systematic attempt to understand it.
Which is fascinating because, like you said, it feels like such a blind spot, and not like a blind spot the way that's often used, which is something you're not quite right. It's like a real, like, it's there, it's in the center of our vision. Everyone knows that military bands, brass bands, the sound of, right, that this has been core to a core element of music, but it's kind of cordoned off as something else. I mean, do you have a sense of like why there has been so little written about this?
That's a tough question. But I've certainly one I have thought about. I think one aspect of it you alluded to in your introduction, which is that it doesn't fit into how people generally think about what music is and what music does in the world. Generally speaking, people have very favorable associations with music. It's something that people, that touches people very, very deeply. People are, intensely attached to. And many, many, many of us can speak to having had musical experiences in our lives that have transformed us, that have elevated us. Music has done like wonderful things in the world to innumerable people, over many, many, many millennia. And so the idea that it might be attached to something much more um, that people feel more ambivalently about, if not negatively, it's hard to square with what music does in the world. So it always seems sort of exceptional, sort of a side road in musical history that maybe somebody would allude to it, but nobody sort of thought, oh, well, this is actually a systematic practice or a set of systematic practices.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and in some ways, it can point towards some of the darker, or at least more potentially troublesome elements of the way that music is kind of traditionally understood as a social technology. It's talked about. It's liberatory. It's emancipatory. It allows individual expression. It allows group cohesion, but it also allows the dissolution of individual identities and voices and rhythms into collectivities, which can be great, but can also be, there's a reason that nations have national anthems.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, there are this capacity to bond people with one another. It's great when you're on the dance floor with people and there's music and everybody's dancing together and everybody feels like they're part of one sort of singular throbbing moment together. But when that is part of bonding a military unit, it's not necessarily bad in and of itself, but when you start to think about that phenomenon as being part of an instrument of state violence, then it gets much more complicated. So military, the chanting of what are called cadences in basic training in the military is a basic part of having musical activity as part of the formation of soldiers, part of the transformation of civilians into warriors. That is a profound and intense experience, one that militaries have been wrestling with. How do you do that? How do you take ordinary civilians and turn them into people who are capable and willing to kill other humans that they don't know? That is a very complex proposition, part of war making. And music has been part of that in that it is part of this process of basic training. It's one thing that connects people to each other. It puts them in sync with each other. They fall into sync with each other when they're marching, when they're doing drills, and they experience that sense of bonding that people feel when they sing together. So, that's part of the constitution of a military unit in some respect, in some way of forming a social bond, a unique kind of social bond.
And so one of the most interesting things that you do in this book, which kind of traces these dynamics from the Civil War basically through the Iraq conflicts, the wars against terrorism. And one of the fascinating things that you do is kind of trace not just the ways in which musical practices are kind of created anew or develop in war after war, but think really carefully about the kind of elaboration of of this ability of the state, of the ways that the state and statal power as it's developing over, the middle of the 19th through the late 20th century, how its use of music is refined in this, like, what worked last time, what will work this time, what's changed type of way. And so maybe to start with, we can start at the beginning and think about kind of what in many ways is the start of your book, but in the last moment perhaps of kind of a very, very traditional form of military music, which is in the Civil War, with kind of Civil War bands, right? Like drum corps go back certainly to the American Revolution. In the U.S. context, I don't know where their origins are, but certainly that kind of, musical accompaniment to marching goes back much earlier. And maybe talk a little bit about how at the start of this massive expansion of state capacity and military organization in the United States, this is the moment where off-the-rack clothing is made broadly available for the public because they need so many uniforms, right? Like, this is a vast expansion of state power. How they use, or how these military bands start being thought of and start being used in that conflict.
Yeah, well, I start the book with the Civil War because it is the first war when a lot of these different seeds start to grow. There, as you suggest, there was certainly music in wars prior to the Civil War. But what happens in the Civil War, first of all, is many people consider it the first modern war, the first total war by some measurements, a war that involves the mobilization not just of the military, but of the whole society, or in this, in the case of the U.S. Civil War, two societies, the North and the South. And in both cases, the militaries involved lots and lots of bands, that different regiments from different states would go with bands attached to them to the front. And these bands, they were instruments that sort of facilitated marching and drills, but also they were a really big part of maintaining morale in the Civil War. Uh, every night there would be band concerts in order to basically keep soldiers. One way of thinking about it is to keep them entertained. Another way of thinking about it is to allay their feelings of homesickness. And people, these are people who were far from home, and they were in circumstances that were generally very uncomfortable, and they had nothing to do at night, basically. Basically, most battles were during the day, and so they had nothing to do. And so the bands entertained them, kept them going um, on a regular basis. This was part of the maintenance of soldier morale. Um, and this is a complement to the kind of more formal music making that bands were doing when they were accompanying soldiers on the march, let's say. And the bands have this function that required, for one thing, large numbers of instruments. And so the capacity to produce large numbers of brass instruments was a condition that the Union, the North, depended on. They were able to scale up production of brass instruments during the war in order to keep this supply chain going for all these bands so just to give you one example of how like common these bands were, and the bands during, I should mention too, the bandsmen during the day, uh, they were often had other responsibilities. Usually they were stretcher bearers. They would be the people who carried
Hmm.
stretchers in a battle when they were like people who were wounded and you had to get somebody off the battlefield. Who did that? Well, it was usually the bandsmen. Um, but so they were very, very present. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, probably the most famous of all Civil War battles, there were at least 10 bands that were present at the Battle of Gettysburg. And remarkably, even at least one of them was playing during the Battle of Gettysburg. That there was actually music at least in one part of the Battle of Gettysburg. And there was a British military officer who was visiting with the Confederate army. And he wrote in his journal after I think this was the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, how strange it was to hear these musical strains being played while the shots were being fired overhead and so forth.
Incredible. So, okay, a couple things. So, one is like this is very much a part of the broader industrial expansion of war, right? Like the same
Yes,
processes that create the uniforms, the same processes that create the guns and heavy artillery and railroads that the war requires are also creating brass band instruments.
exactly. Precisely. Yeah.
How could you hear it over a battle?
Well, one of the reasons why music was really useful for soldiers was that it was, and this is, I have to make a slight digression here, but the short answer to your question is musical instruments were pretty loud. Battles were loud, but musical instruments were too. There was another kind of music that was practiced concurrently, and that was called field music, which were the drums and bugles or fifes or the drum and bugle corps. And they would, in case of drums, they would tap out different rhythms or calls as they were known, that the soldiers would recognize, and these were instructions about what to be doing when and
Right.
where.
Right.
So soldiers would hear these things and they would say, "Oh, time to advance." And there would be a certain drum call that would tell them to advance, and they would know that. Or time to retreat, time to lay down or assemble and whatnot. And so this was practiced because it was loud enough to be heard over the cacophony or in and amongst the cacophony of battle.
Which also makes sense, like, also just like the auditory spectrum. If you think about like the classic like fife and drum. Like drums are low,
Yeah.
fifes are high. There's very little in that middle space. That's interesting.
Right.
Did you know what, in terms of the, and dear listeners, I'm sorry to get too much into the weeds of 19th century music making, but what were they playing? Do you know?
With the
Not on the battle, but like in the
entertainment
in
portion
the
of the evening?
entertainment in the
Yeah.
camps. Yeah. Is this refined compositions that are going into the kind of classical repertoire? Are these minstrel songs? Are they all of
Oh,
them?
that's a key question. Yeah, it's a key question. What you have to realize is that that music was being played for entertainment. So it wasn't, soldiers didn't necessarily want to hear songs about war. And this is true in the Civil War, and it's true in other conflicts, that songs about war are, in many cases, more
Hmm.
popular on the home front than they are among soldiers, because soldiers don't need music to do that for them. They what they need is they need music to do other things, to get them out of where they are. So the concerts that they would have in the evenings among the Civil War soldiers would feature basically the popular music of the day. That's what was entertaining to people, and that could be parlor songs. It could certainly be songs from blackface minstrelsy, those kinds of things. Home Sweet Home was a very, very popular song.
Classic 19th century super banger.
Exactly, exactly. And so at one point there's some, I've seen a source that says at one point the song was banned because it was evoking too many people's plaintive feelings, or their longing for home. It was making them too sad. And so some military officers said, no, enough with the Home Sweet Home. Um, but that's the kind of thing they would have been playing.
And this is also, just thinking again about this as an emotional technology, right? Like this is a maintaining morale and maintaining army cohesion in a moment where, the one of the classic, right, that people's enlistments are up all the time in the Civil War, and keeping, for the Union in particular, keeping, and the Confederacy, keeping the soldiers at the front is a major challenge in much of the Civil War. So anything that you could do to keep them happy and emotionally engaged, rather than feeling like this war is never going forward, and I've been stuck in Virginia and I just want to go back to Maine to do the harvest, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I realized when I was working on the book was that soldiers, and this is a way of thinking about soldiering that I had not come across. Um, Soldiering needs to be understood as a kind of labor. And soldiers are required to perform a certain kind of emotional labor. They have to perform that labor in order to keep doing their work as soldiering. So, in order to be a soldier, you have to do things that require incredibly intense, demanding emotional strains. So, you go and you risk your life, or you kill another human, or you see a comrade in arms killed before you. On the one hand, that requires, and that's really difficult emotional labor to keep going after you do that. And the music helps you do that. The flip side of that is that soldiering always involves a lot of boredom and a lot of waiting, and a lot of just tedium. And music also helps with that. So in order to keep people going, you call it an emotional technology. The music helps people perform the emotional labor required to be a soldier. That's one of the things that I sort of tried to bring out in the book in a kind of thematic way.
That's really incisive, right? That there's so much of this conflict, especially or the difficulty of, especially in a nation that until post Vietnam doesn't really have a standing army the way that the British regulars are, right? Which I'm sure have their own set of emotional requirement but soldiering is a less regular occupation for most Americans in particular, it strikes me, than it is in nations that have a different kind of military structure that might make these technologies even more important than, you know, if you're part of a French legionnaire and this is your profession in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, we can think about that in different military contexts, but certainly the huge surge in military recruitment and enlistment and conscription in wartime does bring, many millions of people into the armed forces who weren't who didn't want to be there and weren't prepared to be there. Um, But I would also say that even among regulars, career military personnel, that music has been important too, and we can sort of flesh that out. Particularly, but it becomes very clear, sort of by the Vietnam era, for example, when you have music doing different things for different groups of soldiers in Vietnam, some of whom are career-oriented military personnel, lifers as they're known, some of whom were others of whom were recruits or draftees and so forth.
So, skipping ahead and kind of thinking about how the military music is used for a lot of people who may or may not want to be there, I think we're going to jump over. Listeners, if you want to know about the complexities of racialized popular songs in the Spanish-American War, you're going to have to go out and purchase a copy of this book because you should listen to it. It's fascinating. You should read it. It's fascinating. But you're not going to get that insight here right now, because we're moving to World War I, which is the next truly expansive American conflict, when the real resources of the American state are thrown into large-scale societal militarization. And it kind of strikes me that here you start getting a clearer structuring of the kind of dichotomy of military music making, right? Where some of this is related to training and kind of the creation and maintenance of soldiering, qua soldiering, and another major effort is aimed at kind of maintaining the emotional integrity of soldiers in the moments when they're not fighting. That you start seeing the split that many of the folks are the same. It seems like in the Civil War, you start seeing that split more directly created and funded by the military.
Yeah, World War One is fascinating because this industrialization of war involves music in a number of interesting ways. Soldiers were issued songbooks in World War One. This was a part of their standard issue equipment, was a songbook. And so the first part of understanding music in World War One it was a war that involved a lot of singing. And singing was a big part of training. There were these huge events at World War One training camps called mass sings, or camp sings, and when you would have thousands of soldiers on a military base singing together as a way of blending their will to wage war and training them to build these bonds with one another. So there were ways, and it was also a tool for getting foreign-born soldiers to speak English better too. That was another aspect of the Senate.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of singing in World War One in training. There's a World War One general who says it is just as essential that soldiers should know how to sing as that they should carry rifles and know how to shoot them. That was how, and this was a hardcore general, guy named Leonard Wood, who was a real nasty character. So it wasn't singing was sort of acknowledged as a really important part of war making, of making a military in a modern sense. And then you also have in World War One the industrial production of entertainment for soldiers in terms of building a relationship, an institutional relationship with the entertainment industry. And
which exists in a different way by this point.
definitely, yes, yes. So you have, vaudeville and variety, and then vaudeville theaters, and these vast networks, these different scale networks of theaters that existed in the commercial entertainment industry in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then they get hitched to the military in World War One. So that people who are veterans of the commercial entertainment industry get brought in to create a comparable or a parallel network of theaters for the military in World War One. So that's just a sort of a different component of this. Then you also have the rise of phonographs in World War One, and soldiers start to listen to phonographs in large numbers in the trenches, in these what we'd later call, you think of as like enlisted men's clubs. They were called, oh, I'm forgetting what they're called at the moment. But they were run generally by the YMCA, and again, sort of hitching this non-civilian, the civilian or non-military institution to the military in World War One. And the YMCA, for example, would run these huts, they were called. Um, and all of the huts were furnished with phonographs and with pianos, so that soldiers could participate in music making when they were trying to, restore themselves. And then also sometimes you'd have them in the trenches and elsewhere. So these are three very different kinds of musical activity, all of which were combining to be this sort of galvanizing force in the military in the First World War.
Yeah, which is fast, and also, I mean, which is another part of just the overall organization of war is like the Creel Committee, and this is this large scale state sponsored propaganda where the same industries that are creating parallel tracks for military are also pushing pro-war messages nationwide. That you talk a little bit, and we'll get there at the end of the book, about the kind of the military entertainment complex. And it strikes me as a moment where it starts. Those maybe aren't the domestic sphere and the I was gonna say commercial sphere, the war sphere are somewhat separated, but there's a set of industrial actors present in both of them, it feels like.
Yes, it's very much true. It's very much true. I mean, you have a kind of thriving Tin Pan Alley industry that's turning out these pro-war songs, but those are mostly for the home front. And then you have the sort of non-military songs being used as entertainment in the military context in the war, through these different instruments, through records, through live performance at these military theaters and whatnot. So definitely, yeah.
So another thing you write about that's fascinating, especially thinking about military, leaving aside the entertainment for soldiers for a second, that as part of this training process, as part of the idea that this should be a singing war and a singing soldiery, there's this question about what the soldiers are actually singing, which is partly this training. Cadences have started in World War One or two.
The cadence, as we know them, will start in World War II. There is some sort of call and response cadence chanting in World War I, though, which I can speak to. But anyway,
the marching singing, right? Some of it is we want a singing soldierly because we can get them to sing good Christian songs and keep our American boys away, like quite literally, from those French whorehouses. But also, and you Americanize them. But this is also a space where soldiers are able to speak out about their conditions and experiences, and you recount some truly shockingly scatological material in this kind of almost like counter archive of soldier songs, some of which come from earlier and pass, seems like for decades and decades, from soldier to soldier, as this kind of way that the soldiery are expressing themselves in relationship to the power structure of the military.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Songs become one of the few tools or instruments that soldiers have available to them to speak back to their conditions. And the military can control the songs that soldiers have when they're staging theatrical shows, but not when soldiers are making up songs and singing in and among themselves. That's a space, a cultural space that soldiers themselves control. So it's a sort of modicum, it's a limited, it's ephemeral kind of control, but one that's very important for soldiers emotionally. And sometimes they sing songs that are deeply cynical about their military experiences. They sing a lot about sex. Some of them are really, really raunchy. Some of them are really offensive. And mostly these are songs that are really written out of the historical record. If you see collections of published war songs from World War I or World War II for that matter, or in some cases even Vietnam, the songs are completely expurgated and the lyrics are changed, or they cut out they change the words, or they could just simply cut out the verses that are so raunchy. But I was able to find actual songbooks that soldiers used. I was actually able to find records of soldiers in their letters and their diaries and so forth, recording what were very explicit, sexually explicit songs. And can I swear on the
Yes,
podcast?
you certainly can.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the songs that becomes known as "Bless 'Em All" in World War II, which is very cynical song, was actually sung by soldiers. They didn't sing "Bless 'Em All"; they sang "Fuck 'Em All." But when these songs get published later, the cynical lyrics are toned down, and the chorus of the song "Bless 'Em All" is changed, or "Fuck 'Em All" is changed to "Bless 'Em All" to preserve this kind of Disneyfied impression of soldier life.
You have this amazing photo, and I'm trying to remember. It is, I believe, from World War One. This amazing photo of this chaplain, kind of like standing over this like vast, like soldiers marching by him. The soldiers are all clearly singing. He said that the original,
Yeah.
but I think this is useful because it gets at the ways that even these oppositional songs can still be used for the group solidarity that soldiering requires. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. It's like a chaplain standing over this group of clearly singing soldiers, and the caption published back home is like they're singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" or something like that. And actually, they're
Exactly.
just like spewing verse after verse of horrifying scatological aggression, basically, which would have been loud and in unison and in front of, at least in this case, an authority figure. But they're also all doing it together, presumably in something like a rhythm, in like a great thunderous chorus as they're marching in lockstep.
Yeah, and this was, part of galvanizing the force. This was a really way of getting soldiers riled up, of getting them to feel bonded to one another. And the instance that you're referring to, there's a soldier who writes about this, and he says that the minister who was, blessing the soldiers as they marched by, and he said, and then it's reported that they were singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." They were singing these raunchy songs, and the soldier who writes about this says that the minister didn't care as long as they were singing and going off to, trying to fight nobly or whatever. That in the actual reality of the moment, there wasn't this tension, at least according to this guy, about the sort of clergy not approving of the song because they understood sort of the context in which the singing was taking place.
Yeah, it gets this sense of like, and one of the classic cultural questions, almost because it's almost a carnivalesque a little bit, in that the classic cultural question or cultural studies question being these moments of kind of expressivity and, symbolic rebellion. Are they, or to what extent are they actually pushing back against authority? Or are they venting some frustration, venting some energy in ways that ultimately reassert the authority? And one of the fascinating things about these soldier songs in World War I and World War II, and this broader cynical soldier culture, is the question of to what extent is music, and maybe it's both, all of the above, right? Whether music is in allowing the articulation of both simultaneously of oppositional tendencies and group cohesion. Whether that's the reason, maybe not the chaplain, but the reason the military brass, the army as an institution, aren't against this is because it actually very much works in their favor. That even if they're singing scatological songs about a great fucking wheel, like a singing soldiery is a better thing than a non-singing soldiery.
That's right, and I appreciate your sort of framing this in terms of a big question about what this really means for the military. If I can step back for a moment, I really think about this book as a cultural history of music and war, and an attempt to understand basically how wars happen. And the answer that I try to develop in the book is that one of the ways that wars happen is through music, is that music enables war making. And the way that this sort of connects to the question that you're raising about sort of like, is this actually challenging the military or not? Is this pushing back against the military? Is it a check on military power, or is it reinforcing military power? And what I kind of realized in the course of working on the book is that it is really doing both, and that both really matter. So one of the ways that I put it in the book is that music is functioning as a lubricant in the American war machine. It's a lubricant in the American war machine. It's something that helps the war machine function. And in that sense, it is aiding the military. The military as an institution. It's aiding the state. But it's also helping soldiers make it from one day to the next. It's also helping them preserve a certain kind of psychic integrity. It's helping them keep their shit together. It's helping them build bonds that may save their lives, that may help them make sense of a senseless predicament that they find themselves in. So it's not necessarily there are a couple of instances where music is connected to pushing back and disrupting military authority. But for the most part, the military does appreciate that soldiers are making all this music because they feel like it's good for the military, it's good for soldiers to keep them going. And the soldiers think so too. They're not unaware of the contradictions and the paradoxes that characterize their situation.
And here's maybe where you can draw kind of a line. And it strikes me that the ways, in many ways, that music is used in World War II really, really build on the example of World War I, in which, much like the mass production of cigarettes, much like the mass production of butter and chocolate, you read these accounts of just Europe, the American soldiers showing up in Europe and having twice as much food as the British and French soldiers. And they also have twice as much entertainment, at least. And part of this, it feels like, as a result of what's made possible by the commoditization of culture, right? That once you have culture as something that can be produced, moved away from the spaces in which it's initially created and circulated, the military can just push the on button really hard, just turn the toggle to like maximum or as much entertainment as is meaningfully possible. And just as part of this huge draft effort where something like how many million, some shocking number of Americans,
16 million
16
American soldiers,
million soldiers who were 100% Iowa farm boys, but no, but like from all over the country, ending up in places, totally different places, that the military just dumps entertainment on them in this conflict, and is able to do so because there are recordings that you can circulate, because there's professional entertainers, because there's Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really a way of kind of broadening the lens on what war mobilization involved in World War II. And I think it's important to drill down a little bit into that and to recognize that not only is not only can we say that the military is able to mobilize the culture industry, but it's the culture, it's both the what today we might think of as the hardware and the software of the culture industry. So the software you can think of as the songs or the entertainers even, who the songs, the entertainers who went and traveled to military bases through the USO, for example. There were millions and millions of soldiers who attended USO performances during the war, when these A-list, B-list, C-list artists would travel around to military bases all over the world to entertain soldiers. So that was a kind of like that's the software of the
Mm-hmm.
culture industry. But you also have the production of records and phonographs and radios for,
Pianos, amazing,
yeah,
indestructible pianos.
and pianos for the military. These are specifically designed for them. They're extra rugged, and they are made to be shipped out all over the world. So it's mobilizing that as a resource as well. There's an industrial, a physical manufacturing component of this that complements the ability to mobilize lots and lots of singers, singers in terms of live performers, and then also the recording artists who performed for V discs, which are called victory discs. These are records made specifically for soldiers in World War II at a time when there was a recording ban going on in the United States that prevented most of them from recording. They were allowed to make V discs when they weren't allowed to make any other kinds of records during the war. So you have this very rich bench of recording artists who are able to make records for soldiers during the war as well.
The Steinway, for whatever reason, there's a lot of amazing details that you pull out in this book, but the Steinway Victory was probably my favorite, which is this like rugged little tank of a Steinway piano that was designed to just like not like survive.
Yeah. They were painted olive drab green, to match everything else in the military. So people's the color of tanks and the color of GI's underwear, and the pianos were all the same olive
I
green.
was like, I want one. Like,
Yeah, there are a few around still. And one of the things that I really found so fascinating about the Steinway pianos too was not just the Army, but the Navy. And these were pianos that were installed in naval ships before they left the shipyard. And when I realized that, when I encountered that, I realized that music wasn't an afterthought.
yeah.
Music wasn't something they were like, oh yeah, we should get some music for these guys too. It was built in from the beginning. It was part of the infrastructure.
So moving on to kind of in some ways, the most famous musical conflict in American life, which is the Vietnam War, which you claim is in many ways misremembered, in that the culture, partially because of the anti-war movement, is very, very tied to music in the domestic, in the United States, but also because of a series of very successful cinematic depictions of war, that the Vietnam War is kind of tied to rock and roll and GIs flying low over the jungle with Fortunate Son playing type situations. But actually, that 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 doesn't give a full depiction of the musical dynamics of that conflict. You argue that there's a lot more going on, and in fact, it's a lot less of a rock and roll war than people think.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I really believe that the Vietnam War is um, misunderstood in that respect. I mean, it's a war that comes with its own soundtrack. When you say Vietnam War to people, there's a soundtrack that comes to people's minds, and it's a soundtrack that comes largely from Hollywood. Um, obviously was a lot of music going on at the time period in the 1960s and early 70s. A lot of musically animated youth culture, but the music that soldiers were listening to wasn't necessarily the music of the counterculture or the anti-war movement. And what soldiers were listening to was limited by the resources that they had available to them, one of which was Armed Forces Radio, which had been started in World War II and then continues, gets a TV component as well, um, and becomes an important part of GI's experiences in Vietnam. There's a poll done to figure out how much GIs are listening to Armed Forces Radio. And in 1968, the military finds through systematic polling that 80% of GIs are listening to 2 or more hours of Armed Forces Radio per day. So the question then is, well, what was on Armed Forces Radio? And it wasn't, by and large, the stuff that you get in Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket or any of the other well-known Vietnam War movies that have music prominently featured in them. What was much more common was middle-of-the-road pop music and country music. And this was what most soldiers were listening to most of the time.
And in some ways, this reflects, I think, the overestimation of the number of hippies in the American imagination, right? Like Nixon wasn't totally wrong in that there was maybe not a silent majority, but like a pretty a under listened to plurality of Americans that had more conservative values, that are listening to music that's been tagged as more conservative, racially coded in case of country music. But also the in some ways the big undercounted part of this is soul music too, in that there's a significant proportion of drafted black troops who were interested in listening, weren't necessarily interested in listening to what even the army, it sounded like, called acid rock.
Yeah, the African American soldiers were recruited disproportionately, and they served disproportionately on the front lines, and they were disproportionately underrepresented among officers, and they were angry about being in Vietnam. Other soldiers were too, but African American soldiers had a particular relationship to the war. Beth Bailey, for example, a historian, has written a great book called An Army of Fire about African Americans in the U.S. military in Vietnam. And they were very attached to soul music. And soul music was not what was on Armed Forces Radio.
Right.
It was not what was on the jukeboxes in the enlisted men's clubs. And so this was what they were hungry for. And there were literally violent conflicts, riots that broke out, the spark of which was riots between African American soldiers and white, often country music listening lifers or career military personnel. They clashed in a number of riots, particularly around 1967, 68, 69. Actually, I think even a little later as well. And the spark of these riots was often something musical. This was the trigger that would sort of bring to a head the sort of simmering cultural clashes, cultural conflicts within the military.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, arguably, this is a moment when musical form is most polarized politically, potentially in American popular music. That there's really some of the sonic innovations or stylistic innovations that come out of soul and come out of rock, or the more left-leaning rock, do eventually work their way through the broader musical landscape. By the 70s, country music has heard rock. By the end of the 70s, country music has heard rock in ways that country music in 1968 didn't necessarily have an engagement with. I could just imagine that mapping being stronger than is true later.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are a couple of points. I mean, one is that it is important to clarify what I mean by country music. This was mainstream Nashville country music. This was not what would later be known as sort of outlaw country. Um, this was very much mainstream Nashville country music, very apolitical, um, and very much coded with associations with a certain kind of white um, conservative politics. Um, you would get much more interesting crossover later. And occasionally you would hear on the military armed forces radio, um, a rock song, but it was mixed into a pop music mix. And so it was kind of, in a sense, deracinated.
Sure.
Its politics were deracinated. It was sort of like stripped of its cultural context. And the what you'd get on listening to a daily program on Armed Forces Radio, like one was called A Date with Chris, hosted by this pinup named Chris Noel. She would help host, it was a pop music show every afternoon. And she would play this mix of soft rock. Maybe there would be a country rock song with a country song with lots of like lush string arrangements. You might hear really very kind of Baroque stuff. You would hear pop music like the Beach Boys, or Jan and Dean, or that kind of thing, surf music. Um, really saccharine, tepid kind of music at odds with the more intense musical culture that was going on stateside. And I just want to emphasize there were people in the military who were deeply, deeply invested in those musical cultures stateside, but they were a minority. They did not characterize what was going on in the U.S. military writ large. They represented, 10, 15%, maybe 20, probably not, of the military. These were the people who were like the real music heads, who, were tracking, what the more intense
So
musicians were doing.
what's interesting also is connecting what starts happening in Vietnam technologically to later conflicts, especially deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, is you also have the relative absence of these same kind of musical conflicts. I'm sure there's some fistfights about what's being played in Iraq between U.S. soldiers, but much less. And it strikes me that the two things that fundamentally change as we leave Afghanistan and look to the present and future for the last couple of minutes here is, for one, a fundamental change in the U.S. military in that it goes, so far at least, from draftees to all volunteer force, professionalized all volunteer force, but also in a change that we've kind of tracked but maybe not named so far, is the move from a singing soldiery in World War One, where most musical experiences are collective and individual engagements, right? Like the individual soldiers are singing, through World War II, where there's less singing and more listening, to Vietnam, where there's conflicts about what they're listening to Iraq, where, as you kind of say, it starts off with CDs, but by 2007, everyone has their own iPods, and the individualization of music that the digital revolution makes possible seems like fundamentally changes what music means and what role music plays in modern war making. That it's a much more individualistic and lot in many ways less collective, or at least if it's collective, it's mediated by individual relationships with screens than was previously true.
Yeah, I mean there are a few points in there that I try to make. One of them is, I mean, first of all, music, singing is not as prominent in Vietnam or in the 21st century as it was previously, but it doesn't disappear. So, we might think of
Sure.
Vietnam as a sort of post-singing era, but there's an interview with these Marines during the Tet Offensive, and some CBS News reporter says, "Well, how do you guys, keep your shit together at night?" And they respond, "Oh, we sing and play cards." So these are Marines in the Tet Offensive. So they're singing in Vietnam, and they're singing in the 21st century. They're informal musicians in the military still. So that doesn't disappear. There is this kind of increasingly sort of customized relationship to music based around playlists, and there's an iPodification of military listening in some respects, but sometimes that was over speakers. The collective experience
Hmm.
doesn't disappear. There are songs that were popular for individual units, individual military units, that they would listen to together before going out on patrol, for example, or out on an operation.
A lot of Drowning Pool, it sounds
Drowning Pool
like.
was the biggest. Yeah, there are other artists who are named frequently. Eminem is one. Um, Sometimes it's, yeah, there are a number of others, but Drowning Pool, and particularly Bodies, this Drowning Pool song Bodies, it comes up almost in every account of music in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. Thinking again about one of the things I've long wondered about is that there is also this funny thing with Iraq and Afghanistan where it's this, even before 9/11, it's kind of a particularly aggressive moment in American popular music. That these nu metal bands, which have this complicated cross-racial, right? They're really pulling from hip hop. Even nu metal bands, I think that, thinking about Bodies, that don't have that much rapping, are very rhythmically oriented in their groove, right? More than Slayer. Like Bodies has a real groove that's not tempo-wise that different than a lot of kind of boom bap hip hop grooves. There's a kind of a ready-made soundtrack for war in this moment that then gets picked up and used in this really interesting way.
Well, I think that also speaks to a point you were making a moment ago about um, how the absence of intense conflicts over music in the 21st century, that we don't see the kinds of clashes in the military over music that we had in Vietnam. And one of the reasons is that hip hop and country music are both spreading so much more widely in American culture. There's so
Mm-hmm.
much more hip hop influence in, you know, other musical styles, and country music has spills over far beyond what it had been earlier as well. So I think, that's those are sort of two factors that help explain um, this kind of broadening of the musical experience in the 21st
Sure.
century.
So one of the things I think that's really interesting, that's kind of a final point, is the way you talk about the power of music in these conflicts that, at least for American soldiers, where so much of the damage is psychological. The importance of music as a way for maintaining just psychological integrity, as a way, as a kind of an ameliorative technology for these counterinsurgency operations that are not, it seems like a different kind of tension to go out and fight the Germans at the Battle of Bulge than it is to be on patrol and anything could be an IED. And I wonder, looking forward, whether what you think about what music's doing now, and how those tendencies might continue in a world defined by, what we read about in the front in Ukraine, right? Where it's remote drone operations near the front, digitally mediated. It seems like all of those dynamics are only exacerbated by these new technologies of war.
I think the surge of drone warfare is the crucial development that will set this current moment apart from the
Mm-hmm.
past. There's this the dronification of the military, if you will, um, can be used to periodize where we are now as different. We're part of a different era than when you needed boots on the ground to wage
Sure.
war. And where we are right now in the Middle East, there is a lot of destruction, a lot of killing going on, as we speak, and it is not done by boots on the ground by and large. And so the ways that music gets integrated end up being different. It ends up being the music that military personnel are listening to wind down, for example, and to use music as a balm, as a kind of salve to deal with the stresses of being a drone operator, for example, or just the dailiness, the daily strains of military life. But until we have another conflict involving large numbers of active military personnel fighting, we're not going to have a good sense of how music today compares to, say, the Iran and Iraq war, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Yeah. I mean, I also, you talk about the experience of people in the green zone, for example. I
Mm.
mean, whether that actually might be like, the people running drones on destroyers that are, or aircraft carriers near war, whether that kind of in the war and out of the war position might be more common, at least for American soldiers going forward, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly that is the direction that things seem to be going in. And that has its own stresses and its own complications. So, I'm not sure. I can't speak to where this is gonna go. I don't make predictions, but um, we do, as we see the military changing. It seems very likely that music will have a place in the future because it has so extensively in the past. Um, and as a point of clarifying sort of, my orientation, the orientation of this argument about music being a lubricant of the war machine. The point isn't that you couldn't wage war without music. I wouldn't argue that. That's a sort of counterfactual. The point is that the U.S. military hasn't waged war without music. The point is that music has been present, and so trying to understand what that means historically, what that has meant historically, means thinking about what it has done and how people have used it in the past, suggesting that there will probably be music in the future too.
Well, David, thank you so much. Everyone, be sure to check out David's book. It's really wonderful. We'll link to it in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Sam, can I put in a plug for my website too?
Yes.
There's a website for the book with lots of music and pictures and videos that hopefully complement the book, and maybe if listeners want to get a taste of what the book involves, you can go to my website. Hopefully, you can link to that in the show notes as
Sure
well,
can.
and get a taste of the breadth of material in the book.
Okay. Well, thanks again.